So in the last section, we talked about asexual reproduction, or mitosis, which is a way that cells are reproducing for the purposes of replacing cells that die, allowing for growth of an organism, and in some cases, this can be a form of actual reproduction. Like in a single-celled organism, it might reproduce by mitosis. So a couple of vocabulary words to get us started. Asexual versus sexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction is where there's a single parent, and all of the genes from that one parent are passed in an identical fashion to the offspring. So the offspring, in essence, is a clone, a genetically identical offspring to that parent. And all the offspring in mitosis would be clones of each other as well. And this works out really well when you're talking about replacing skin cells and bone cells and things like that. Sexual reproduction, which is what we're going to be talking about in this chapter, have to do with two parents and the offspring have a combination of genes from the two. So it's, even though it may somehow favor one over the other, maybe in some certain physical features, just because that particular parent carried more dominant traits than the other parent, they're still getting exactly 50% of the genes from mom and the other 50% from dad. You have 50% of your genes in common with each of your birth parents. You have about 25% of your genes in common with your siblings. Because every time sperm and eggs are made, it's 50-50 which copy of chromosome 1, which copy of chromosome 2, etc. And so you're not going to have 50% of your genes in common with your siblings. You're actually going to have only about 25%, just a comment. All right, so that's asexual versus sexual. So first of all, why would asexual be a benefit? Why would an organism want to only reproduce asexually? There are reasons. One, you don't need a partner. If you look into the amount of effort that's spent in birds and mammals seeking out and wooing a mate, there's a lot of effort put into that. Certain birds, they have to build a nest and offer a gift and do a courtship dance and sing a special song, and it's a lot of work. It's a big investment. So if you don't have to find a partner, you would be able to reproduce on your own. It would save time, it would save energy, so that's a benefit. A second benefit has to do with the gene combination. Every time you reproduce sexually, you're only passing on half of your genes, your partner's passing on half of theirs, you're going to get a new unique combination, which might be better, might be the same, or might be worse than what you have. If you've got a gene combination that's working for you, obviously I don't mean us, because people can't reproduce asexually, but if we could, if I had no diseases and I was surviving really, really well in my environment, if I reproduce asexually, I'm going to make little clones of me, which will also be perfect and wonderful in every way. So that's a benefit. And a lot of times plants, which can sometimes reproduce asexually, will actually resort to asexual reproduction when they're in a stressful environment. Because if they've got a gene combination that's helping them survive in that environment, they already know that works. Why take a chance and reproduce sexually and possibly make an offspring that can't survive in the environment you're currently in, when I can just make lots and lots of copies of me because I already know my gene combination is working. So that's the benefit of the benefits of asexual reproduction. We even know that it can occur in vertebrates in some cases. This is this picture, Komodo dragons. The female Komodo dragon in a zoo, she had no partner. She laid some eggs, and they basically developed by what's called parthenogenesis, which is kind of weird, but it's basically where unfertilized eggs develop and hatch. Not doesn't happen in mammals that I know of, but in some reptiles and amphibians you see things like this happen. It's not very common, no. And these offspring would all be clones of one another. Another example of this are bees. I know that bees, unfertilized eggs, are what hatch and become the worker bees. They're sterile. They can't reproduce. I don't know if these Komodo dragons are sterile. But I know worker bees are sterile, but it works great because they live in this whole social network. So the drones mate with the queen. The queen does nothing but get fed and lay eggs, which probably isn't too bad. The workers do nothing but gather food and protect the hive. So everybody's got a different job. So again, there are some benefits to asexual reproduction, but the biggest benefit to sexual reproduction is the fact that you get new variations, because that can offer a selective advantage. Why does an organism make it through, a species make it through an ice age, or make it through a drought, or live through some kind of a disease? It's because of sexual reproduction. There's always a few in the bunch that are suited to survive better than others. Whereas if we were all identical, you know, a disease comes that affects one person, it would kill everybody. We even know of people that, for example, are resistant to HIV. They can't catch it. They've been exposed to it. It does not survive in them. Not very common, but that would just be one rare example of where variations in people might offer a way to survive when the environment does go through changes. So that's the whole idea of natural selection and survival of the fittest. The fact that the birds are slightly different colors and sizes and shapes may allow some to survive a harsh winter, or some to survive, a drought, or whatever the situation may be. So having the genetic variety is the biggest benefit of sexual reproduction. It has allowed organisms to evolve and change and survive through generation after generation. All right. So a couple more vocabulary words. Most of these we've talked about before, but I just want to make sure, because these words come up a lot this chapter and the next couple of chapters. So genes, I say that word all the time. You know, genes for eye color and blood type and skin tone and how tall you grow, etc. A gene technically is a segment of DNA that codes for making a particular protein. So even when we're talking about eye color, the genes for eye color technically are just codes for making pigments that make your eyes green or brown. In theory, blue eyes are really just that your genes are broken. You don't make any pigments. So the leftover color that you see without any pigment is blue. Same is true of blonde hair. In theory, what the genes code for is making reds and brown pigments. So if you have light hair, it's because some of your genes are basically probably originated from a mutation, but the genes basically don't code for anything. So your hair comes out lighter. And the same is true with lighter skin. You have more copies of genes that don't code for making pigment. The more copies you have that code for pigment, the darker your skin will be. Yes? Yes, I mean, theoretically, yes. Theoretically, we could, yes, and we could go even further. If we know where the genes are located, in theory, we could genetically engineer embryos to where we injected them with something that changed their DNA so that everybody would have blue eyes or green eyes or whatever color we wanted. So yeah, we could play with that, which would be scary. It would be like Hitler, but on a genetic level. I mean, some genes, yes and no, because that's the whole idea, and that's a whole other thing we're going to talk about, is like GMOs. There's this whole thing about GMOs, which are genetically modified organisms. You'll see a lot of advertising now, no GMOs, blah, 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 because they're saying they've genetically modified these organisms to make certain foods. Like they've put certain genes into this plant that make the plant frost resistant or whatever. They claim that it can't hurt you, because if you're just eating it, you're going to digest it. It's not actually going to get into your body. But now they're discovering certain links from genetically modified organisms that by messing them up and then you eat it, it can then affect you in some way. And that is something that they're discovering now. Just like they thought if you injected cows with certain hormones to make them grow faster and fatter and get meat sooner, that wouldn't affect us. And then you had all these girls that are going through puberty at 7 years old from drinking milk. Because the milk that we gave, the hormones we gave the cows to make them grow faster, end up in the milk. And the little kids drinking the milk are now having prepubescent puberty, or precocious puberty is what it's called. And they're going through puberty at 6 and 7 years old when they shouldn't be, because the hormone's going from one organism to another. So the more we mess with stuff, we don't really know what we're doing. And that is the scary part, is that we think we're messing with one thing, or like you said, mess with the gene, well, we're just controlling the gene for eye color. But how do you know that gene doesn't somehow affect some other trait that we don't realize there's a connection? Gametes are your sex cells. They're haploid. They have only one copy of each chromosome. Somatic cells have 2 copies of each chromosome. They're diploid. Matching chromosomes are called homologs or homologous chromosomes. Other than homologous chromosomes and the word gene, all these other words were in the previous lecture as well. Again, sometimes this is called homologs. I believe it's spelled like that, homologs. The 2 chromosomes are homologs of each other. I may have that spelled wrong. But the bottom line is, this is just like what you've been doing in the karyotypes. Homologous chromosomes are the ones that are similar in size, the band patterns are the same, and they carry genes, information about the same traits. They're not identical to each other. You got one from your mom and one from your dad. So if this particular chromosome codes for blood type, you're going to have a code right here on this copy that you have for blood type, and you're going to have a code on the other one for blood type. But it doesn't mean that the codes are going to be the same. My dad was type O, my mom was type A, and I'm A. So I know my dad had to give me the code for O on the chromosome he gave me. My mom gave me the code for A. A happens to be dominant over O, so that's why my blood type is A. That's the whole, what we'll get into with genetics. But the bottom line is the code is in the same location, but the code may not be identical. It may code for a different version of the gene, a different color eyes, or a different blood type, or whatever. And the combination of the two would then result in your final traits. We already looked at these. This is what your karyotypes look like. They stain them. They put them in order by the band patterns and the size, the location of the centromere. Sex chromosomes go last. And that brings us to how our chromosomes are organized. So we already mentioned in the previous chapter that there were 46 chromosomes. But they are actually in pairs, 23 pairs total. 22 of those pairs are known as autosomes. Those are all the chromosome pairs that don't code for sex, basically. And then you have one pair that we call the sex chromosomes, and those are the ones that code for whether you're male or female. In people, and I think in most mammals, it's actually the same system. Pretty sure in mammals, XX is female and XY is male. I think across the board. It's different in different organisms. In birds, it's ZW is a female, and I think ZZ is a male. In some fish, there's one male and a bunch of females. When the male dies, the biggest female turns into a male. So in some organisms, it isn't about chromosomes determining sex. It's determined in other ways. Did you have a question?
Yeah, so how about like people that are born?
Technically, nobody is born male and female per se. I don't know of any case where people are born with ovaries and testicles and a vagina and next to it a penis. Like, that doesn't happen. What can happen is that you end up with like a partially developed penis that doesn't fully grow. Or you have what looks like it might be a vagina, but there's no uterus. And instead of ovaries, they have testicles, but the testicles are inside them like ovaries. So what happens in cases like that, those people would be considered hermaphrodites. What it is that typically, the most common example of this is that they get an X and they get a piece of a Y. They don't get the whole Y. And they have a disorder most of the time called androgen insensitivity syndrome. So they have the Y chromosome, or at least a piece of it, but for whatever reason, their cells don't respond to the testosterone properly. So they don't fully develop. So they don't become, technically, they don't fully become male or female. Usually what parents are going to do in a situation like that is they're going to do some kind of sex reassignment surgery, make a choice. But no matter which situation they have, they're probably never going to be fertile. If they make them a male or they make them a female, they're not going to be able to have kids. They're gonna probably have to take hormones to try to sort of force their development one way or the other, and they're gonna have to have surgery to fix their external organs to make them one sex together. So that's what technically happens with hermaphrodites. It's typically not a genetic thing. If you're XXY, you're male. The Y chromosome, that's actually the only thing it mainly does, is it makes you a male. So even if you get two X's and a Y, you're not a hermaphrodite, you're a male. There's some feminization. You can read about it. That's Klinefelter syndrome, but you're definitely male. You have all male parts. They're sterile also. And if you get X nothing, that's Turner syndrome. You have an X, you don't have a second sex chromosome, and you automatically develop female. They also have some problems with like not going through puberty properly, and there's actually some other side effects to it also. I think some heart conditions and things. I know that with both of these, particularly with Turner's, there's a specific look to the child. Sort of like how Down syndrome has a specific look that you recognize it when you see somebody with it. Turner's, there's a specific look. Their hands are shaped different, their face is shaped different. Klinefelter's, it's possible you could have a boy born with Klinefelter's, and the symptoms can be very, very mild, like they just don't grow a lot of facial hair. They tend to have more feminine, like hairlines, and they store fat more like a girl. But they might not even realize it until they figure out that they're unable to have kids. And they might go get a karyotype done and discover that the reason why they're sterile is because they have Klinefelters. So it could be very, very minimal that you actually are pretty much male. Yeah, the hairline in girls is different than boys. If you look up Klinefelters, you'll see that our hairlines are somewhat different. And our body shapes are somewhat different, like hip-wise and that kind of thing. So, yeah. Yeah, the hairline, that's what I read, that their hairline is more feminized, which, yeah, I've never really noticed that either, but apparently you can look it up. And yeah. Yeah. Yeah, men do tend to have more chiseled facial shape, too, so they might have a softer shape to their face. This picture is just showing homologous chromosomes in pairs.